I've got no problems with buying shiny new things or paying someone to do something for me that I might not have the time or ability to do myself, such as the electric fence that I showed you the other day down the back. But when I can repurpose something or redo something or reuse something, I will. G'day, I'm Mark from Self-Sufficient Me, and in this video I'm going to show you an example of how I repurposed some old galvanized mesh that I wasn't using anymore, it was just sitting in the shed, to make some seedling and young plant shelving off the back of our water tank here. Let's get into it. By the way, if you can hear a bit of a hum in the background, that's just the neighbour. It's terribly hot here at the moment. It hasn't rained for ages, and he's using his dam, just pumping out some water onto the grass, probably for his horses. So just a background story, really quick. When I first started keeping quail, I didn't know much about them, and I just followed what most other people were doing and kept them in little cages. I repurposed an old swing set from our kids, and I used the frame. They were up off the ground, they were safe. And I also made, out of some shelving units, specialised caging with a roll-out floor made from this type of mesh, so that when the quail laid an egg, it would roll out. However, as time went on, and pretty quickly actually, I realised that that wasn't the most humane way to keep quail, so I subsequently built a large quail run, and they are much happier in that environment. I was left with a whole heap of this galvanised mesh, and I wasn't going to chuck it out because you just never know, you can use it for all sorts of things. But one issue I had here was, where do I put some of my young plants that I haven't planted yet, some of the young trees that I might buy or pot up, or some of the cuttings that I grow? I have two really cheap mini nurseries that have lasted me for years because I've just kept on patching them up. But I don't really use them that much because I find that in the subtropics here, there's not a real need for us to nurse plants and seedlings underneath these types of structures. What I've found is I either direct sow into the garden or direct plant, or I just nurse plants on this side here of our water tank. And the reason for that is, through the hot summer especially, it'll get the morning sun, which is cool, which is good, but it won't get the afternoon sun. And that's critical because the afternoon sun here, especially about between 1 and 5 or 1 and 6, is extremely hot and debilitating and draining. And it's fine in the morning, you can come out and water the plants, and the morning sun is nowhere near as harsh. So it doesn't sap the guts out of these poor plants and seedlings. And I've just found, after trial and error, that this is just a perfect place. But I lacked shelving, so what I could have done is buy shelving straight off the shelf at the hardware store or whatever, and then just hung them here, or bought some shelving units and put them against the tank here in this area. But instead I thought, I'll rummage through the shed and see what we can find and see if we can just repurpose some materials. First of all, if you've been following me for any length of time, you'd know that I've got plenty of Rio mesh around, and I repurpose that all the time as trellising material and all that. And you can see it actually is the wall brace for this tank here. And all I've done is I've bent over the Rio mesh and just sat it onto the top of the tank, and that spreads the load out. And then I've just secured it in some certain spots, like this galvanized piping here, with a bit of wire so that it won't pull out, and it's seated in there really well. All I've done for these trays is get that mesh, just a rectangular piece, then cut it into some places, and then just fold them up to make some sides. A really crude way of doing it, but dead set easy. And I just love the little tray that it makes, and that it's so open and free draining. Plus they're so strong, and besides being strong, it won't rust because it's galvanized and it's not plastic, so it won't suffer or crack underneath the UV rays and the sun, heat and cold. No matter if a tray is UV treated or not, if it's under direct sunlight, I tell you what, it won't last very long anyway, but this will. And see these steel chains here that are holding up the front of these trays? That's just repurposed from old hanging baskets that we weren't using anymore, and they do a perfect job. of just supporting the front of these trays so that, you know, you're taking a bit of stress off the back here where they're just fixed to this Rio mesh. I'll let you know a little experiment that I'm doing here with these tomato plants. Tomatoes at this time of year just don't grow here, especially in the normal garden. All our tomatoes now have perished. It's just way too hot. But like I was saying before, because this gets, and this is this experiment that I'm doing, growing tomatoes in the afternoon shade where they just get the morning sun and no harsh afternoon sun seems to be working okay. And I've since planted some out into some other pots and I've put them down below, growing them into a bigger container. But I also, with this experiment, wanted to keep them in a smaller pot just so that I could manage it a bit easier. So what I decided to do was, and a pretty simple thing, was put in a little bit of plastic here. In this case, this is just an old bag that had some compost in it from the store, and I've just squished it in there to make a self-watering tray. So when you water the plants, they will sit in some water for a while until that evaporates. It's only about that deep, and in this temperature and heat and the wind blowing, it won't take long. It might last a day or two, but essentially it's a self-watering tray, pot, shelf. That's what I've turned it into. Because it is so through the weather and free draining and sitting out like this, it is a bit susceptible to dry out. But it doesn't really make a heck of a problem generally, especially through the cooler months. However, one other thing that I've done here is, and I just did this today, put in some coconut coir. You can get it anywhere, or you can use whatever you want. You could even use cloth or old rags or anything really, and that just slows down that drainage of water and just keeps it damp underneath for longer, keeps that cooler underneath the pot, stops the pot or the seedling trays from drying out too fast, especially in the summer months. So that's just an easy modification. If you find that through winter it needs to drain more, because you don't, the worst thing you can do with young plants and seedlings is to have them sitting in wet seedling mix constantly, because they will just rot. Through the winter time, if I'm finding that this needs to be more free draining or more evaporation, well then I'll remove this. And this other tray over here, well, it hasn't got anything underneath, but I do have a self-watering pot, so it really doesn't need this sort of crude self-water that I've made, but nevertheless it fits in there nicely. It's a nice big easy tray, and it's all made from repurposed materials. Well, the pot isn't, but the tray, that's what I'm talking about, the tray or the shelving, and you can just see how strong it is and how well it works. So anyway, I know that's not a really long video, but I thought that I just had this on the back burner for a while, and I wanted to show you an example, another one. I've done example videos before of repurposing, like the pallet wall down the back, or making jars or cuttings or containers, reusing containers, and I will show you plenty more in the future too. But this is just one thing that I had on the back burner that I wanted to show you as an example of repurposing to make seedling shelving. It works really good for our position here. So you just never know what you've got in the shed that you can repurpose. Before you go out and buy something specific that you need for a task, have a look in the shed, have a look around the yard. What can you repurpose instead of buying that new that does the same job or maybe even a better job? Thanks a lot for watching. Bye for now.